So we had a preliminary definition of philosophy, which was more or less that philosophy is the love of wisdom. And that indeed is the Greek roots of this word philosophy. The philo part comes from love. It's a platonic love. The sophos part, the Sophy part comes from sophos, which is wisdom. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And as Socrates makes clear throughout this dialogue, it's the love of all wisdom. It's not the love of a particular kind of wisdom. And as we've been discussing, wisdom is that faculty within our soul, this capacity that we have within us to discern between true and false. Okay, so we're going to try and sharpen this definition a little bit more and make it a little more technical, because what Socrates really means by philosophy is something a little more specific than the general understanding that philosophy is love of wisdom. What he's really saying is philosophy has a certain kind of knowledge. So when we're trying to discern whether something is true or false, Socrates says what you really need as the basis of that discernment, the basis of that judgment, is a certain kind of knowledge. Now, what kind of knowledge does the philosopher have that other people don't? Well, according to Socrates, it's knowledge of ideas. And it doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. So the word that Socrates uses is eidoi. So that's ideas in the plural. In the singular, it's eidos, E-I-D-O-S. I didn't write that up, but that would be idea. This often gets translated, and I don't know why they do this, because as you can see, eidos and idea, our word idea comes straight from eidos. It's very similar in sound, for example. But it often gets translated, this word eidos, as forms. And I'm not that pleased with it, but here's what they're trying to say. When Socrates is talking about things like the form of justice or the form of beauty, in your head, all you have to do is think about the definition of justice or the definition of beauty. Because what Socrates is getting at, and what our translators are trying to help us see, is that Socrates thinks that ideas have a shape to them and that they can be defined. They're concepts with proper definitions. So you remember this thing with Socrates and Thrasymachus, one of their major points of disagreements was whether words were just arbitrary and referred to human conventions, or whether words could refer to concepts which were not defined by humanity, but concepts that have definitions that humanity could discover through philosophy. Okay, so now we're seeing the sort of deeper philosophical basis of that disagreement. And what Socrates is really after is the idea that ideas have proper definitions, and a properly defined idea has a form. Let's put it like that. So you remember that definition of justice. Justice is each part playing the part for which it is best suited. That's the form of justice. That's the definition of that idea. So it's not anything more complicated than that. Okay, Socrates in book 5, though, lays it out through not the definition, through not the example of justice, but rather the example of beauty. So beauty, too, is going to have a form. And as we'll see, Socrates thinks that ideas, there are two kinds of ideas that are really important for philosophers to have. The first is mathematical ideas, and the second is ethical ideas. So mathematical ideas would be things like ideas of addition and subtraction and triangles and squares. Ethical ideals or ethical ideas have to do with things like the definitions of beauty and justice and truth and goodness. Okay, so now we're going to be working with one of these ethical ideas as our example for this whole theory of ideas. So here's what Socrates is basically arguing. He's saying, in this world, in this material world, in this world that we can perceive through our senses. I can look around, for example, and see many beautiful sights. I can see a beautiful sunset, or I could see a beautiful building, or I could see a beautiful person. And I can use my senses in the same way. Let's talk about my sense of hearing, and I can hear a beautiful music, or I can listen to a beautiful poem, or I can listen to a beautiful speech. Socrates' idea is that there's something beyond all these beautiful particular things, these particular beautiful things, called beauty itself. And in your head, just capitalize beauty, capital B, beauty, itself, capital I. Because for Socrates, that is the idea, or in English, ideal really captures what Socrates is getting at better, the ideal of beauty. And Socrates' argument is that there is an ideal of beauty which has a definition, and it has a proper definition. And when the beautiful things in this material world conform to that ideal of beauty or that standard of beauty, they are thereby qualified as beautiful things. Socrates likes to say they participate in the ideal of beauty. Okay, so that's the unifying idea of beauty that underlies all beautiful things. It's from that ideal that particular beautiful things are endowed with beauty. We could put it like that. Now that sounds all pretty common sense until we realize that Socrates is saying that the ideal of beauty is more real than any particular beautiful thing. So this will be elaborated in book 6, so I'm not going to say too much about it right now, but our common sense way of thinking about things is to say that the material things in this world are the most real things. Matter is the most real thing. Okay, and the things that we can see through our senses, those are more real than any ideas or any forms or any abstractions. And then our idea, our common sense way of thinking about things, and I'm speaking as contemporary Americans or ancient Greeks, the common sense way of thinking about things is things like beauty are just abstractions whereby we see the common characteristic of beautiful things. You have to take that way of thinking and flip it upside down to get yourself into the Socratic mind frame. Socrates is saying, actually, beauty itself, the idea of beauty is eternal. It doesn't change. It's defined, not by us. It's kind of naturally defined. It's an objective standard. And that idea of beauty is more real than any particular thing. Now, how does he make this argument? Well, Socrates would say, take a beautiful sunset. That sunset, yes, may well be one of the most beautiful things you can possibly see. But what do you notice about it? It's gone in an hour. It's a process. It changes and then it disappears. Or if you take a beautiful flower and let's say it's in full bloom, and let's say it's the middle of spring, and let's say you see it and it's so beautiful, it just knocks you off your feet with beauty. And then the next season comes and it's fall and the flower withers and dies. So there's something about the things in the material world that is always changing, which is always growing and decaying, which is always coming into being and passing from existence. And it's that impermanence, Socrates says, which is our surest sign that the material world is not the most real thing there is. And Socrates would also say that it's precisely the ideal of beauty, the definition of beauty, that is more permanent, that is more fixed, that is more eternal, as it were. And that's a sign of its superior reality, its superior being. That's what Socrates is really trying to say. It has a superior kind of existence because it transcends the material world. And these ideals like beauty and justice are not just good for one time and one place and one culture and one language. These ideals of beauty are what philosophers call universal. They're supposed to be universal, which is just the Greek way of saying the one across many, the one across many, the one idea of beauty, the one idea of justice that goes across many, many, many different cases. So you can see here that the analogy is to say there's justice, there's the idea of justice, and it allows us to say, well, that was a just action, or that was a just war, or that was a just city, or that was a just person. So this is what Socrates is really after. This book, if you really want to dig into the ultimate reasons for why the philosopher should be king, the argument goes something like this. The philosopher has a special kind of knowledge that other people have to a lesser capacity or don't have at all. And philosophy has knowledge of ideas. These ideas are mathematical and ethical in nature, and the philosopher has knowledge of them. Though that knowledge of math and philosophy basically corresponds to an unchanging order of reality. And this is the reality of ideas or ideals. Everybody else is just a kind of residual category. They are non-philosophers. And what they have is beliefs. We'll talk more about beliefs in book 6, so I won't say too much. But the beliefs correspond to a lower order of reality. And that order of reality is our material world. And that's the order of reality where I'm looking at a beautiful flower and I look at the flower and I say, that's beautiful. And that is my belief that is beautiful. And Socrates would say, that's a correct belief. Okay, this whole thing, this whole diagram that's on the page right now, I know it's, I'm doing it very fast and we're going to come back to it in a more developed form. So if you don't get it right away, don't worry about it too much. The important thing to see is there are two levels, and these are ultimately two levels of reality. There's the ideal reality, and then there's the material reality. And Socrates is saying what the guardian class is going to have, what the philosopher type is going to have, is access to that higher level of reality, and that is the ground. That is the reason that the philosopher should rule. That's the reason the philosopher should be a guardian. That's the reason philosophers should be kings. Okay, so we looked a little bit at the philosopher side of the philosopher-king equation. Let's talk a little bit more about the king side. Socrates claims that philosophers would make the best rulers. What does this claim really mean? Well, there's very uncharitable ways of interpreting the philosopher-king idea. And you can imagine that many of Socrates' contemporaries who consider themselves realists or skeptical, or they just weren't buying it, would have actually made fun of this idea. And in our day, we still have this ongoing skepticism, this ongoing attempt to satirize what Socrates is saying. So I'm just going to see if this shows up. Excuse me. I've got a comic here. This is Existential Comics. It's a philosophy comic. Here's the joke. The joke is the philosopher king is just going to do the Socrates thing from the throne instead of doing the Socrates thing out in the marketplace. Okay, so the idea is Socrates is not going to adjust philosophy at all to make it more suitable to the role of a king or the role of a ruler. So here's the joke. King Plato. So here's Plato up on the throne. King Plato, the ambassador for the Persians, is here. Ah, good, let him in. Ambassador. King Plato, one of your lords has attacked our outpost. We demand justice. Plato. Ah, but what even is justice? Ambassador's a little baffled. What? Plato. Well, you say you want justice, so you must know what it is. Ambassador, we don't have time for that. Okay, so you can see the joke here. He is literally conducting a Socratic Q&A, trying to get the ambassador to define justice, trying to test the validity of the definition. At a certain point, and it goes on and on, they get into the definition of an army. They get into the definition of, I don't know, war. Okay. And you can see what happens at the end. As King Plato is getting impaled by this sword, he's asking, but what is a sword? Okay. And the joke is apparently on the philosopher king. The joke is apparently on Plato. So on this less charitable interpretation, what we have is the idea that philosophy will substitute for politics. And what is called for in politics, making quick decisions, for example, when your city-state may be under attack, is something that philosophy cannot actually provide. So that's the meaning of Plato getting stabbed with that sword at the end. I think there's a more charitable interpretation, which is that philosophy is not going to just be conducted from the throne, as it were, but somehow that philosophy is going to be made more applicable to politics. And I think the idea is something like this. In the same way that Socrates conducts his dialogues with his fellow citizens and basically tries to teach them and basically tries to improve the citizenry's minds and basically tries to get the citizens to see as much of the idea or the ideal as possible. To that extent, the guardian class as a whole will be conducting dialogues and basically trying to educate their fellow citizens. Okay, so it's the idea, I think, is that instead of rulers just giving commands and saying, my word is law, and I don't have to explain myself, I don't have to give reasons for why the law is this way or why the decision is this way. I think Socrates' idea is actually the ruler in a just city would have to, because that's exactly the whole point of the Socratic dialogue, is to see what reasons are correct and what reasons are not correct. What arguments work, what arguments pass examination. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the second thing is, what Socrates would say about this cartoon, for example, is Socrates, the philosopher king is not going to be debating the definition of justice when it's time to say, are we going to war or not? The whole point about Socratic philosophy is it's an ongoing activity. You don't just do it one day. And part of what wisdom means is being able to distinguish like an emergency situation from a more calm and peaceful situation. And so I think the idea is more like, look, the philosophers or the guardian rulers are going to have these debates about justice, and they're going to figure out what justice is. And then they're going to be able to apply justice in particular situations. So in the case of war, if a war has to come to it, what you're going to have to understand is, hey, is it just to go to war or not in this situation? And that's what the actual dialogue would be about. It wouldn't be about what is a sword. That's not a philosophical argument. Okay. So the idea is that philosophical knowledge is relevant to political knowledge. And because philosophical knowledge is the most encompassing kind of knowledge, remember earlier I said philosophy is the love of all wisdom. Philosophy is the love of all kinds of knowledge. Because philosophy is more encompassing than politics, political knowledge is included within the kinds of knowledge that a philosopher will have. Okay, so that's the idea. Today I wanted to talk about two things. The first is um, Socrates claimed that the true king or the best king is actually the philosopher, no one other than the philosopher. And then the second thing I want to talk about is a kind of elaboration of that two-level diagram with those two orders of reality and so forth. Uh, we've got more complicated diagrams, more developed diagrams, and these diagrams speak to the question of Socrates' theory of what reality is. Okay. Philosopher king, Socrates realizes, is a paradoxical figure. And paradoxical in this case just means it's contrary to the common sense of his audience. Literally, this word paradox means next to or besides something other than opinion or common sense. And the common sense is philosophers would make the worst kings. Philosophers are useless. Philosophers, you put them on the throne and they'd be debating philosophy when what they really need to be doing is making political decisions. The idea is that the philosopher king is some kind of oxymoron because philosopher king is like saying wet dry or up down. Okay, these are two things, they just don't work together, they contradict one another. Socrates' response is pretty simple. He says, the problem is most of you, you're actually thinking about a politician. You're saying a philosopher would make a lousy politician, and Socrates would grant you that. But then Socrates says, if you knew what a true statesman was, if you knew what it meant to be a true king or a true queen, you'd see that the philosopher would make the best king or the best statesman. So what is the statesman? Socrates gives a story at this point. He says, imagine that there is a ship at sea and that the ship represents the state. So the ship is going here in our story, it's going to be like a city state. And you can see what's built into this metaphor or built into this figure of the ship. The idea is, hey, if this ship sinks, everybody is going down with the ship. If this ship arrives at a safe harbor, then everybody on the ship has a common destination. So you can see here, the idea is we're all in this together. The ship is our common home and we're going someplace and we're either all going to get there together or we're all going to sink to the bottom of the sea. So that's the ship of state metaphor. And the owner of the ship is the representation of the citizenry of a city. So whose ship is this? Obviously, it's the ship owners. Whose city is this? Obviously, it's the citizens' city. Okay. How is the ship owner characterized? Well, they're big and strong, but a little bit short-sighted. So the citizenry is big and strong because there's so many of them, for example. And when they get it in their mind to do something together, they can do a lot of things. So they have a kind of power or capacity. Okay, but they're a little bit short-sighted. Well, what does that mean? Well, in the case of the ship owner, it means that they aren't really thinking of the long-term interest. They aren't really thinking, well, where is this ship headed? Where are we all going together? And part of the reason that they're a little bit short-sighted is because they haven't really got sailing knowledge. They haven't really got the arts or crafts of navigation under their belt. Okay, so they don't really know much about sailing. And in the same way, Socrates is saying, most citizens don't really know that much about conducting affairs of state. They really don't have that much knowledge or really that much interest in politics. Okay. The crew is the group of people who steps in to take advantage of the ship owner. Why? Because the ship owner is not really that concerned with sailing. The crew is the one who is constantly fighting for control of the ship. The crew is the ones who are constantly saying, hand me the wheel. I'll tell us where we're going. Make me the captain. All this, despite the fact that the crew in this ship of state metaphor has no better idea of how to sail than the ship owner. They do not have any superior expertise or superior knowledge. They just know they want power and they know how to fight for power. They have no idea what to use that power for. They have no idea where the ship should actually be going, but that doesn't stop them from drugging the ship owner, from stealing from the ship owner, from saying to the ship owner, hey, shouldn't I be in charge? Okay, and the analogy here is between the crew and the politicians in a city. So the politicians, remember, are like pseudo statesmen. They have a pseudo expertise. And fighting for control of the wheel, that's fighting for control of the government. Having little knowledge of sailing, once again, little knowledge of politics. Drugging and stealing, I think the metaphor should be obvious. The politicians are going to use fancy words to trick people. That's drugging them. Stealing from the owner, well, collecting taxes and all this, and enriching themselves, all that. Private ownership, enriching their households. Okay, we know the drill. There's one or maybe a few small figures standing off at the side. And they are the true navigators. And they get called a useless stargazer because what are these navigator types doing all day? Well, they're doing the stargazing. And they're trying to figure out, the relations between the constellations. And they're trying to figure out how changes in what you do with the rigging and the masts and the rudder and the wheel, how those correspond to where the ship is actually headed. And in other words, the true navigator is actually trying to discover what the art of navigation is. They're actually trying to acquire an expertise in navigation. So it looks like they're useless because they're not over there like the crew fighting for the wheel. And they're not over there trying to flatter the ship owner into handing them the wheel, but they are actually the most useful person on this ship, according to Socrates. They're over there minding their own business, which in this situation of a corrupted ship, that is doing the job they're best suited for. So it's just that the navigator is actually sitting out the power struggles on the ship. And the true navigator stands for the true statesman, which, as we see on the slide, just means the true philosopher. Okay, and what they're trying to figure out by gazing at the stars, that metaphor, is they're trying to discover what the ethical ideas are. They're trying to, through Socratic dialogue, figure out what is justice, what is true, what is beauty, what is good. So the problem is most citizens get the politician and the statesman confused. Most citizens get the sophists and the philosophers confused. So now popular opinion confuses philosophers with sophists. And it's an easy confusion to have because the word sophos, the word wisdom, is actually in both of them. And both philosophers and sophists are a kind of intellectual type. And both philosophers and sophists claim to be useful for people who are not philosophers and not sophists. So you can see here that popular opinion, it confuses the ship owner in the last story, on the last slide. Okay. What does the wisdom or supposed wisdom of the sophist actually consist in? Well, the sophist is kind of like the crew who is trying to drug the ship owner in that little parable of the ship of state. And now Socrates is going to give us a different metaphor. He's going to say that the sophists are like a beast tamer, like a trainer of some mythical, monstrous beast. And this is on page 214. So I'm going to read a little bit here. This is a description of the sophist and the crowd. It's as if someone were rearing a large and powerful beast and spent his time learning its moods and appetites. So first of all, Socrates is saying that a crowd which has been bamboozled, which has been tricked, which has been flattered, which has been cajoled, manipulated, basically. A crowd that has been manipulated by a sophist is like a beast. It's not using its reason. It's not using its most human capacities when interacting with this sophist. They're using their lower appetites and moods. Remember, that's the lowest part of the soul, according to Socrates. This person learns how to best approach it and handle it when it is at its most awkward, or indeed its gentlest, and what made it so, and the occasion for various sounds this beast would utter, what sorts of voices would calm the beast or send the beast wild. And when he'd acquired all this knowledge by spending so much time with the beast, decided to call it wisdom and turned to teaching, claiming to have established a body of expertise. This is just another way of Socrates saying that the sophist is an expert in crowd manipulation, which for Socrates is not a true art or craft. That's not a real expertise. It's akin to quackery instead of the real deal of medicine. Sophistry is like quackery to philosophy's medicine. Okay, so sophists are experts in crowd manipulation, and that's their wisdom. That's what their wisdom really amounts to or consists in. What is the wisdom of the philosopher? Well, as we said, wisdom is a sort of excellence or virtue of the philosopher's soul. And what wisdom allows them to do is make right judgments, including judgments about what is real and what is not real. And they can make those judgments because they have a certain kind of knowledge about reality. So what philosophical wisdom ultimately consists in is knowledge of reality. Knowledge of reality. Most specifically, the reality of ethical ideals, things like justice. Socrates is going to take another step further, though. He thinks that the philosopher knows ultimate reality, and ultimate reality is something Socrates calls the good. What is the good? The closest thing to the good in our times would be something like the monotheistic God. God is the ultimate reality. God explains why there's anything at all. This is the idea that God is the ultimate creator and the source of all existence. And if you want to know what is most true, what is most real, in this universe at least, it's God. The big difference between the Socratic idea of the good and the monotheistic, the Jewish, Christian, Islamic idea of God is that for Socrates, the good doesn't really have a personality. The good is an idea. So the good does not have intentions. The good does not have moods. The good is not commanding humans to do this or that, as the monotheistic God gives commandments or gives laws and so forth. So the good is a kind of impersonal, ultimate reality, and Socrates calls it an idea. Now, just like the monotheistic God, though, you can't define the good. I mean, just imagine trying to define God in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. It doesn't make sense. You cannot really capture the good fully in words. You can You can get at some of God's attributes, but you can't fully define it. Not in the way you could define something like justice or beauty. It's the same with the good. You cannot fully capture the good with words. You can say it has certain attributes, like saying the good has ultimate reality. I guess that's a kind of definition, but it's always going to somehow exceed the definition. It's that real, and our words are just not that good. They're not good enough to capture the good. Okay, so the idea of the philosopher, or really the ideal of the philosopher, is to turn towards the good. And sorry, this is a clunky metaphor because it's not like turning the body, it's turning the mind towards the good. It's thinking about ethical things. It's thinking about questions like, what does it mean to live a good life? Well, what do you mean good life? Well, I mean a life that participates in the good. I mean a life that is somehow derived from the good. Okay. And the philosopher's job or function, be it in the just city, where the philosopher is a guardian, or the unjust city, where the philosopher is just an ordinary citizen, the job of the philosopher is to guide others towards the good, to get them to turn their mind towards these ethical questions. Okay, so the good cannot be defined, but the good can be analogized. We can give similes and metaphors that help us glimpse what the good is, and that's precisely what Socrates is going to do. This is called the simile of the sun, and the basic simile is the good is like the sun. So the good in the realm of ideas is like the sun in the material realm. It's a very strict kind of analogy. So let me just lay out the terms of this analogy. Thought experiment. Let's say there's a person standing out in a field looking at an object. So there's a tree out in the field, and there's an observer, and they're looking at the tree with their eye. Socrates asks, Glaucon, Adeimantus, doesn't there have to be something else in the scenario that allows the eye to see that object, that allows the observer to see this tree? Glaucon and Adeimantus, yes, I think you're talking about a third thing, Socrates, and that third thing would be something like the sun. Socrates, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, guys, because the sun is what gives light, and this light bounces off that tree and thereby projects the image into our eye, and that's how we see things. Glaucon and Adeimantus, of course, agree. And then Socrates says, isn't there a further function of the sun in this thought experiment or scenario? Isn't it true that without the sun, you wouldn't have trees to look at in the first place? Because isn't the sun in our physical world what sustains all life? Socrates gets the agreement of his partners in dialogue, and then he continues. He says, so the sun does two things in the physical world. It allows us to see things, it enables visibility, and it also is the source of all life. It sustains our biological existence. Okay, now in the same way, Socrates is saying, you can imagine the mind trying to look at an idea or a form. So the mind has an eye, let's say. The mind's eye is trying to apprehend or grasp a form like justice, a form like beauty, a form like courage, a form like wisdom, trying to define it basically. Doesn't there have to be a third thing in this scenario too? Socrates reasons. And could we call that thing the good? So the good is going to operate like the sun operated in the physical world. It's just going to operate in the ideal world. And Socrates is saying the good sheds a kind of light onto ideas and sheds a kind of light into our minds. And Socrates here is working with the metaphor of enlightenment. And the metaphor is like the light bulb goes off. Where did that light come from? Do you think it just came from some chemicals in your brain? Socrates would say no. Socrates is saying what you're getting is a glimpse of the good. What you're getting is a glimpse of the good. And usually you get that aha, that light bulb feeling when you're dealing with some pretty big and pretty philosophical and pretty important ideas for how you live your life. In other words, when you're engaging in a kind of ethical discourse, that's when those light bulbs start going off. Okay, so the good enables intelligibility in the same way that the sun enables visibility. Enables intelligibility is just a mouthful for saying the good is what allows you to see the idea. The good sheds light, and we use that light to think. Okay, to continue unpacking this extended metaphor, Socrates is saying that the good also sustains ethical life, that the good also sustains our reasoning capacity. So, what does this mean? It means the good is the ultimate idea, the good is the ultimate reality. If you keep asking what exists, what exists, what exists, what exists, eventually you come to this highest level of reality called the good. And things like justice, things like wisdom, things like beauty, goodness, these are all species of the good. They are like subcategories of the good. Do you see how this is working? So if that's true, if what Socrates is saying is true, and this theory of ideas or theories of forms is right, if there were no the good as the ultimate reality, there wouldn't be objective moral ideas or objective moral standards like justice to begin with. In the same way that if the material world didn't have a sun, we just have a cold, barren world without trees, without human beings around to see those trees. Okay, so the good explains why there's any such thing as objective morality to begin with.